Neoclassical Organization Theory. Please understand that there is a long trajectory of research within these two respective fields. There are many researchers, and I would encourage students to review or to continue reading about these two fields and the different research that's been done in these two fields. Today, you'll get an overview of theorists that are especially important to understanding in order to understand educational settings. Let me just make a brief point about theory. Perhaps this point does not need to be made given some of the posts that I read last week. But just to clarify, there exists a dialectical relationship between theory and practice. Theory is about mobilizing ideas, arguments, and explanations to try to make sense of practice, but also to influence practice. When we see things differently, we do things differently. When a person claims, for example, well, that's all theory and this is practice, the person is failing to realize that all practice is informed by a certain theory. When school leaders are not clear about the theories that inform organizational practices, it is quite easy to run into trees. Too often we fall into a methods fetish. Just give me the stuff to do my job type of mentality. In doing this, we sometimes seek technical solutions that may limit the organization's movement in a positive direction because they are haphazard. Understanding organization theory matters, not just because it helps us understand and influence the direction of our organizations, but because it's fundamentally about creating the type of world that we want to live in. Let me also make a brief point in regards to markers of difference, since Patty Chance does not raise it in the chapters you read last week. Classical and neoclassical organization theory were built off of imaginations, or a lack of imagination of the other. These theories were advanced mainly by white men. Very often the worker was theorized as genderless. Also important is that these theories arose to a significant extent to deal with the question of how to deal with the immigrant worker and working class people's labor interests. These are important points to keep in mind as you read about organizational theory. So let's begin with a brief definition about organizations. Organizations may be defined as associations of several to many people who are attempting to fulfill a common goal. A number of scholars have elaborated on this basic working definition. The basic definition suggests, as you might imagine, that organization theory has deep roots running all the way to ancient times. However, most organizational theorists view the beginning of industrialization and the factory system as the beginning of economic organizations and the beginning of the field of organization theory. Let's begin with classical organization theory. It's important to note that understanding classical organization theory isn't important just for its historic value. Current theories of organizations directly and indirectly point to the theory, and educational organizations continue to be influenced by it. Many scholars in the field of education claim that this anchor to classical organization theory is a major reason why schools are not keeping pace with changes in society. Yet these critiques are not limited only to schools. It's important to note that, now we get a tremendous amount of media coverage on schools, a lot of it negative, but it's important to note that sort of this connection to classical organization theory doesn't exist in schools alone. Classical organization theory emerged from the early 1900s to 1930. It is a wide field that is comprised of the merging of three fields: scientific management, bureaucratic theory, and administrative theory. Important pioneers of this theory included Frederick Winslow Taylor, Henri Fayol, Max Weber, and Mary Parker Follett. Before looking at the work of each, let's look at the major assumptions of classical organization theory as a whole. Classical organization theory believes that there's one best way to perform tasks in the organization. The way to find the best way is through systematic scientific inquiry. Formal communication processes between employees and management must be in place. In other words, you avoid conflict by defining tasks, defining accountability, and formalizing all procedures. Specialization and division of labor is key. Third, people and organizations act in accordance with rational economic principles. In other words, workers are motivated by means of money only. We can already see how a number of these assumptions may be problematic in the field of education, as current research has pointed to this notion that teachers are not motivated solely by money. I mean, there are other interests involved. Fourth, workers are considered as a product of means of production or as a cog in the wheel, so to speak. So the applicable metaphor we can use to think about classical organizational theory is that of a machine. Efficient, hierarchical, highly centralized, planning-oriented, highly regulated, and tightly controlled. It's important to note the historical context of the work of Taylor, Weber, and other classical theorists. The railroad industry was under increased attention in the press for increased rates, and it was a period characterized by widespread labor unrest. A lot of these theorists actually got into their work by helping these industries sort of deal with this labor unrest. Taylor was responding to the needs of the time, for example. Also, in the late 1800s to about 1920, there were major changes in the United States that demanded changes in informal and individualistic approaches to social organization. The population of cities rose as a result of European immigration. Large rural populations shifted to cities due to declining agricultural work. Large factories arose. The work of these classical theorists should not be dismissed, therefore, as simplistic. They were pioneers of their historical context, and their theories were successful to a great extent given the complexity of the organizations and the time in which they were designed. So let's look at some of the major theorists within this school. First, we have Frederick Winslow Taylor. He's known as the father of scientific management. Taylor pioneered the development of time and motion studies, which involve breaking down complex tasks into small, simple steps. The sequence of movements in those small steps is carefully observed in the effort to eliminate wasteful motions. The precise time taken for each correct movement is measured. From these measurements, production and delivery times and prices can be computed, and incentive schemes can be devised. He believed in closely matching each worker to each task. Taylor's underlying assumption was that the majority of workers put minimal effort into their work if they knew they can easily get away with it. He referred to this behavior as soldiering. For Taylor, the lack of productivity in an organization is tied to the lowest level of the organization, that is, with what workers do or don't do. Taylor believed that workers should be closely supervised, and rewards and punishment should be utilized as motivational tools. Many of Taylor's concepts and theories are still in use today. One can sense Taylor's influence in organizational structures where what matters most is production. The people who actually do the work in organizations are a second thought. Organizational pride and the effect that workers have, and the affect that workers have towards their labor are not as seriously considered. Nor are workers seen as professionals capable of collectively determining the most effective methods of organizing the work environment. A great deal of the principles centered in No Child Left Behind and Race to the Top are built off of Taylorism. Of course, the U.S. has a stronger tradition of local school control than many nations, so the manner in which these policies are articulated and implemented in different states and local contexts differ. The use of scripted curricula in education, for example, can be traced to Taylorism. The legacy of scientific management is substantial in education and across spheres. Other theorists of scientific management expanded on Taylor's work. Lillian Gilbreth was one of the first female engineers and a person deeply interested in education. She wrote her dissertation actually on efficient teaching methods, and her husband Frank were important in this regard, in pushing Taylor's work. Both were from Providence, Rhode Island, by the way. The main argument against Taylor is this reductionist approach to work dehumanizes the worker. There's no room for the individual worker to excel or think. Its application in education has been referred to as an effort to de-skill teachers. Next, we have the work of Max Weber. Unlike Taylor, who focused more heavily on the individual worker, Weber focused on the organization as a whole. His theory of bureaucracy, first published in 1922, is the most influential statement on bureaucracy and the point of departure for all further work on the subject. Weber emphasized the need and importance of hierarchical structure and power and a formal set of rules to standardize the organization. His work expands on Taylor's work in the sense that he does not dismiss division of labor and task specialization. Educational leaders of the time quickly took to implement bureaucratic patterns in schools. This continues to have a tremendous significance on schools today. Examples include grouping students of similar ages and level in the same classroom, and this, by the way, was uncommon in the early 19th century. Differentiating teachers by the grade they teach or the subjects they teach at the secondary level, establishment of a hierarchy of administrative offices from the superintendent on down, explicit rules about the functioning of each job beyond licensure requirements, the focus on developing technical knowledge regarding the job, and the fixation on standardized testing data today, and, for example, documentation type regimes like what is commonly found in schools and known as RTI, or response through intervention. These are all structures that closely resemble the work of not only Weber but also Taylor. Next, we have Henri Fayol. Henri Fayol developed the first comprehensive theory of management. He would be considered among the administrative theorists in classical organizational theory. If you recall, there were three strands to classical organizational theory. One was scientific management, the other was bureaucratic theory, and the third was administrative theory. So he believed that his concept of management was universally applicable to all types of organizations. He defined 5 management functions: planning, organizing, commanding, coordinating, and controlling. He also outlined 14 managerial principles in line with the major assumptions of classical organizational theory outlined earlier. Now, I'm not going to review all of these 14 principles, but if you go to any search engine and you enter Henri Fayol's name along with 14 principles of management, you will find these 14 principles and you can review it. But all of the principles are basically in line with classical organizational theory and the assumptions behind the theory. So, some criticisms of classical organizational theory. First of all, it's seen by many as very rigid and mechanistic. Right? It assumes that people are motivated to work simply out of considerations of economic reward. Strong bureaucratic controls places a limit on individual discretion, which runs counter to the American ideal of individualism. The emphasis on technical issues, rules, hierarchical reporting structures, strict specialization, and so on, does not satisfy the human need for belonging and community. Many educational scholars would claim that schools are more complex than what traditional bureaucratic theory would suggest. For these scholars, the fact that they're modeled largely on classical theories is what makes them alienating places. Next, we have neoclassical organization theory. Neoclassical organization theory is also often referred to as the human relations movement. Patty Chance, as you've probably noted, refers to it as the behaviorist period. As the name suggests, it is a theory that arose out of critique to the lack of humaneness within organizations, structured on the principles of classical theory. There are two reasons why classical theory remains so powerful in schools today, despite neoclassical critiques. First, neoclassical theory did not develop a comprehensive theory of its own, but rather borrowed from many fields. Institutions in search of concrete principles are therefore more drawn to the prescriptiveness of classical theory. So if you're a leader, a school leader at the time, or even today, we could argue, most folks are interested in what am I going to do on Monday? What can I realistically put in place on Monday? And classical theory addresses these needs more readily than neoclassical theory. Second, neoclassical theory did not attach itself to the notion that it was universally applicable, and it was more theoretical rather than based on empirical investigation. Despite these limitations, neoclassical theory contributed extensively to organizational theory. Most modern theories of organizations build off of neoclassical theory. Some important neoclassical theorists include Elton Mayo, Chester Barnard, and Herbert Simon. Let's look at each of their work briefly, and from this overview you should get a good sense of the general trajectory of this school of organizational thought. Mayo and colleagues conducted a series of experiments at Hawthorne Works, a Western electric factory outside Chicago. The objective was to study if workers would be more productive depending on the intensity of light in the factory. The workers' productivity seemed to increase when changes in lighting were made. The findings of the study basically claimed that workers' motivation increased because an interest was being shown in them and their well-being. Subsequent studies on different interventions yielded the same findings. Now, it's important to note that there's been major critique of Mayo's the structure of his research. So that's important to note, and hopefully you'll pick some of this up on the readings. Mayo also found that solidarity among the work group increased satisfaction with the work. He felt that the formal organization, i.e. management, should therefore use this knowledge in the effort to control the workplace, although he did not use the term control explicitly. Harry Braverman, in a seminal book called Labor and Monopoly Capital, The Degradation of Work in the 20th Century, brought heavy critique to these experiments and saw them as efforts to control and de-skill workers. Braverman also documented worker resistance to these studies. Despite this critique and the various critiques that followed, Mayo's work challenged the classical theorists by demonstrating that other social aspects of the organization were also important in maintaining motivation. Next, we have Chester Barnard. In The Functions of the Executive, written in 1938, Barnard sought to create a comprehensive theory of behavior in formal organizations that centered on cooperation. He felt that cooperation was important to an organization. The executive's responsibility was to create a sense of purpose, a moral code, ethical visions, and so on. The executive had to also create systems of formal and informal communication and to attempt to create structures for people to cooperate. People, according to Barnard, are to be induced to cooperate. It should be clear that in both classical and neoclassical organization theory, conflict has no place in the organization. Later, contingency theory will arise to address the notion of conflict in organizations, and other theories such as Marxist and neo-Marxist theories will also address issues of conflict. Next, we have Herbert Simon. Simon critiqued classical organizational theory as inapplicable to many of the administrative situations facing managers. So he's important for taking sort of current concrete situations and demonstrating how it does not fit, or classical theory is not able to address the complexities of what managers are facing. He tried to show contradictions in the work of Fayol as applied to organizations and concluded that they were not principles at all, but rather proverbs of administration. So the major contributions of neoclassical theory. Bowman and Deal in 1997 highlight the major assumptions of the theory, which also serves as contributions to the field. One is that organizations exist to serve human needs rather than the reverse. This assumption was more pronounced after the introduction of Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of human needs into organizational theory. Second, people and organizations need each other. Third, when the fit between individual and system is poor, both suffer. And fourth, a good fit profits both the individual and the organization. Other contributions of neoclassical theory include organizations cannot exist independently and isolated from their environments. Neoclassical theory opened up the door for later sociological studies. Organizations are not simply rational, they also exhibit non-rational aspects. So neoclassical theory opened up the door for an explosion of studies in theory on organizations, including the human relations approach, modern structural systems approach, power and politics approach, and cultural perspectives of organizations. Understanding classical and neoclassical organizational theory is critical for educational leaders. Schools are shaped largely by classical organizational theory, but there's often tension between the two. For example, a school may claim that it practices, for example, site-based management, meaning that teachers make decisions. Yet teachers at the school may complain that too much of their time is taken up deciding minor issues like how much time students should spend in transition in the hallways. The time that these issues take up minimize the time that may be spent in preparation for teaching. Despite the appeal to neoclassical theory in addressing the human need to control one's work, classical theory still rules the organization, since the hierarchical structure determines that most important decisions are made at the top. Understanding these tensions is critical to the creation of more responsive organizations capable of addressing the needs of modern society. Understanding these theories will help us understand how they are too often recycled and promoted as innovative. Too often this has detrimental effects on schools and ultimately the lives of youth.